Uh-oh. The last cookie.
You can get a new box of cookies in as fast as an hour with Walmart Express Delivery.
Are you my guilty self-conscience?
No, I'm the voice offering you promo code EXPRESS for free delivery on your first order.
Hey, who ate my cookies?
You mean, these cookies?
Order now. Welcome to your Walmart. Promotion valid for first express delivery order. $50 minimum subject to availability. Restrictions apply.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only. Then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
The last thing you want to hear when you need your auto insurance most is a robot with countless irrelevant menu options. Which is why with USAA Auto Insurance, you'll get great service that is easy and reliable, all at the touch of a button. Get a quote today. Restrictions apply.
I was in college at the time, and that song, we were going out, life was exciting. I was kind of starting my adult life.
Welcome to another new episode of Live Through That. I'm your host, Mike Hipple, and on this podcast, we'll dig a little deeper into a pivotal moment into the lives of some of my favorite artists from the 80s and 90s. But this week, we're doing something a little different. We're talking to music journalist and author Annie Zaleski, who has contributed to The Guardian, NPR Music, Rolling Stone, and many others. She's written many best-selling books on Taylor Swift, Lady Gaga, and my personal favorite, her 33 1/3 book on Duran Duran's Rio. Her newest book is titled I Got You, Babe, A Celebration of Cher, which will be in bookstores on May 6, 2025. I wanted to have Annie on the podcast because not only is she an awesome and insightful person, but some of my first musical memories revolve around Cher. My parents had an 8-track of Cher's greatest hits and would play it frequently on car trips and such. That pink cover with Cher kneeling down in a white flowing tunic of some sort is burned into my brain as one of my first musical memories. So we're trying something a little different this week, talking about Annie's work on this book and how she got to where she is today. And I guess the best place to start is, why was Cher so important to Annie?
It's funny because I don't remember a time when, Cher didn't loom large in my life. And I think partly because that's my age. I grew up in the 80s and 90s, so I'm a little bit younger, I guess, comparatively to maybe some of her, older generation fans. I hope that doesn't sound bad, but no. So, so she was always a presence, when I think, obviously, like, If I Could Turn Back Time was such a huge radio hit. Like, that was all over the place. I have memories of that as a kid. She was just everywhere. She was ubiquitous. And so, and it's funny because I think I have vague memories of maybe, her 90s fallow period a little bit, like, not so much, it wasn't really on my radar, but where like I really reconnected was around Believe. And I think that's like with many people, I was in college at the time, and that song, we were going out, life was exciting. I was kind of starting my adult life, and that song was everywhere. There was just something so buoyant about it. The fact that she was making this comeback, she, sounded different. She sounded futuristic. It really resonated with me. And, ever since then, the more and more I would read about her career, and not just her, music, but also her movies and everything she went through. But especially her music, I think, over time, when I looked at how many records she put out, the things that we all know, but the things we don't know, and just how versatile she is, her range, like that was just really inspiring to me. And the fact that she's always just been herself. I mean, I know it feels like a cliche, but she just does not care what people think about her. She is always herself. And, when, and I think she'll probably be, the first to tell you that, that can be difficult sometimes because, you suffer if, you're not compromising on your art and not compromising on things. But she's really been a role model for women to not worry about, basically to kind of do what you believe in and do what your heart is telling you, and just to keep going and not let anyone tell you, oh, you're too old, or, or you're, People like, don't make that kind of music, or, people don't collaborate with people. She's just like, this is what I want to do. And I believe in it, and I believe in myself. And I think that's very inspiring.
Cher's vocal stylings are very distinctive and often imitated. I sometimes think people denigrate her voice and maybe make it a punchline or whatnot, and I wanted to ask Annie about her thoughts on this.
I'm not sure why people think she doesn't have like musical range or versatility. I think she has a very unique voice, and I think that trips some people up. But she's a phenomenal vocalist. When she put out a Christmas record a couple of years ago, and she reached out to her vocal coach, who was well into her 90s at that point, because she's like, I need to get back into shape. I need to make sure I can sing. She has an incredible instrument, and she has really taken care of her voice. She's been doing all sorts of live performances here and there over the last year or so, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction ceremony. She's done a couple of other things, charity events and things like that. But she is incredible. Like her voice, obviously I think early on she was kind of finding her voice, but she's always had a powerful voice. There's a story that's told that on one of her very first recording sessions. She was dating Sonny at the time, or it was just, they were both, at least both hanging out, and it was a Phil Spector session. And she was this was on the Christmas record. Darlene Love has told this story that, actually, I take that back. Cher might have told that story. Scratch that. Anyway, it was one of her very first recording sessions. It was a Phil Spector recording session. She was so powerful. They had to tell her, hey, you need to back up from the mic a little bit. Like, you are so powerful. And she was a teenager. So she actually has an incredible voice. And I think that's part of what plays into everything, is people, maybe because of the style of music she was making, because early on it was a little bit, I think her and Sonny were seen like people didn't know what to do with them, because their music was so different, and so different from what was going on at the time culturally. But she has an incredible voice. And so there's that versatility, but also in terms of, the style of music she's made. She made a record with the Muscle Shoals Sound Studios at the Muscles in 1969. She did these beautiful covers of things, back in the early 60s or late 60s, early 70s. She covered a ton of Dylan songs. She's covered, For What It's Worth. She's covered Otis Redding. And so, she's always had this kind of career as an interpreter. But then as she's gone on, she fronted this band called Black Rose. She tried to basically kind of be a little bit like under the radar. Like the PR actually didn't say, oh, this is Cher. But she was basically a rock singer. Like, they put out this wonderful one record in like 1980. And it is just this like kind of glammy, kind of new wavy, a little bit power pop, sort of like very AOR record in 1980. And you listen to this and you're like, this is such a great record. If a band put this out now, people would be flipping for it. But because it was Cher at the time, and people were like, what is she doing? She can't do this. It didn't maybe get as much attention as it should have been. They only released one record. But over time, she's done dance music, she's done electronic music, but she's also, covered, straight up, obviously she did more rock stuff in the late 80s, but then she's covered, Marcone. She's covered, these really kind of interesting, more soulful things, more ballads. She self-released a record, basically after, that where she wrote her own songs. It was a very, very obscure solo record. It's funny enough, it was called Not Commercial. So she's done a lot more than people think.
Annie's enthusiasm for Cher and music in general is so contagious. I wanted to ask her what her favorite Cher era was.
The Black Rose, honestly, like I'm a big fan of that. She also put out, funnily enough, a couple of disco records in 1979. And it's funny because they're very of their time. But there's all sorts of funny stories about how she ended up like doing those. But there are some songs on those records that are just like, how did this not become a massive hit? She has this song called Hell on Wheels, which is kind of like a disco rock song. It was on the Roller Boogie soundtrack, which, if that gives you any indication, it was like super disco. And she had a very primitive music video for it. But it's like basically like everything, when you hear like modern, disco rock bands, when you heard people in the 2000s and the 2010s doing these kind of like rock meets dance songs, like that's what this song was. I'm waiting for someone to do a really great cover of this. Cause it's just, I can't talk about it enough. So I like those. And I don't think she's the biggest fan of the disco era, but I think that's good. Obviously her late 80s era, AOR era, just because, and early 90s, because that's stuff I really grew up on. And I think those are just, really strong records. And she really got a chance to kind of let her inner rock star sort of fly. And she always wanted to be a rock star. There were all of these quotes that she said that in the 70s, like she wanted to be cool. She wanted to be like hang out with people and like be considered cool. And instead that she was doing, she didn't really have a lot of choice to what she had to record. And so she was recording, she had all these number one hits, but it wasn't what she wanted to be doing. And so I kind of like those different eras where she's a little bit more rockin', because I feel like that's, that Cher kind of asserting herself. But like I said, I love all her dance music, Believe, a lot of the stuff. I love her ABBA record, actually. It makes so much sense that Cher, was obviously in a couple of the Mamma Mia movies, or one of the Mamma Mia movies, but she, she covered ABBA songs. I'm like, this is perfect. It's kind of, 70s, and, she's just kind of going for it. But I know I mentioned earlier too, the album with the Muscle Shoals that she recorded there, and it's called 3614 Jackson Highway, and it's a really wonderful album. Like I said, if anyone else put out this album, people would be like, "Gosh, this is so cool," But David Hood's on it, Jimmy Johnson on it. There's all these. She's basically singing with this amazing band, and it just does not get as much credit as it deserves, I think. And so that's another kind of favorite, I guess.
I've been a fan of Annie's for a long time, and I'm constantly impressed by how varied her musical tastes are. Cher one moment, Taylor Swift the other, Duran Duran on another beat, REM too. She just loves music.
It's funny. I'm glad you mentioned that. I'm glad you don't think that's a negative, because sometimes I'm like, boy, I'm all over the place. I love music. I mean, I think that stands out from anyone who follows me on social media or listens to me talk. I just have always, I grew up with like really, eclectic musical taste through my parents. My parents were big music fans. My mom saw the Beatles when she was 13. They would go, they saw the Who very early on. They loved Crosby, Stills, and Nash. And, my dad liked new wave music. He loved U2 and the Police and the Cars. And so, and like my mom had, loved folk music like Simon and Garfunkel. My dad, they obviously all love Fleetwood Mac, and, they like Queen. So I had this really great grounding of music, pop music, and also just popular music. And then starting the 80s, like I really just started getting into music, and like, 80s pop music. I listened to the radio a ton. And then, basically I was very lucky enough to grow up in the 90s, which was such an explosive era for everything, for not just things like grunge and, alternative music, but also hip hop and R&B, country. And so that was sort of like my breeding ground. Like I've kind of came of age in the generation where maybe, a lot of the divisions that might have been in different eras. I think the most famous thing is people are like, wow, Journey and Toto, I hate them. They're terrible squares. This is why punk rock was invented, and I came of age where I was like, no, this sounds great. I love it all. And so, yeah, I mean, I have a special affinity for British music. And, going back, obviously the Beatles on forward, I was a big Britpop fan. And I still kind of keep track of, different bands, that come out of England. If I hear, a new, I love like The Last Dinner Party, for example, which I think are very reminiscent of, there's a little bit of Susie Sue in there and things like that. So I'm a big fan of British music still. I tend to be a big fan of women artists, and that could be whatever genre. I think, female is not a genre, as they say, which I think is true. But, I tend to gravitate toward women songwriters, no matter what the genre. That's another thing. But, in rock, rock and roll, like I've always, had that grounding, like I said, growing up. And so, I like, I like hard rock and heavy metal, which I think people might not realize as much because I don't have a lot of chance to write about it, but I'm still a big fan of that. My husband is too. And so we're always talking about that stuff. I think I just keep it offline. But, I love, classic soul, classic R&B, a good song is a good song. And so, like I said, I just really, music is just something that's always really spoken to me, and just is really, but that and reading, I think, are the two things that have been sort of my constant since I was a little kid.
Why hasn't Annie written more about hard rock and metal stuff?
Well, it's funny. So Uh, gosh, 20 some years ago. So I used to write for Alternative Press magazine. I think any older listeners might know what that magazine was. So that started off in Cleveland in the 80s, very underground, would cover, they had My Bloody Valentine on the cover early on, The Cure, industrial music. And so as the Alternative Press sort of evolved, they started covering the Warped Tour scene. And so I did like a whole ton of writing in the 2000s, especially on a lot of the bands in that era. And so, pop punk, metalcore, screamo, all that stuff. And so I covered a ton of that, and I have a lot of knowledge of that. I think part of it is because that kind of music, it can be tough to kind of get assignments for that. Actually, it's interesting because I feel like even when I was sort of covering that, there was a little bit of a curiosity, I think, from the mainstream press, like, what's this all about? Is because it's definitely a different style of music. And so there just aren't as many opportunities to cover it. And it's a very kind of specialized kind of music. Like they have a ton of fans of that music. But I think it's almost like still like it's a niche. It's very fascinating because as popular as some of these bands are, a lot of them, like, I could talk to people that like, I see on a daily basis and they'll be like, I've never heard of that band. And so it's also a little bit more kind of compartmentalized, I guess, a little bit, but I am always open for covering it. If any editor wants to like say, hey, write about this. Because I do think it's fascinating. And there were a lot of like, just really great bands and some really great songs. Like I love Paramore as an example, who's still going. They've really evolved into different things. There's, a lot of bands that kind of took cues from the 80s and 90s and things like that. But in heavy metal, and that's another one, I think that people just, it's so popular. I mean, you look at these festivals and they sell out. And so there's a lot of people that go to them. And I think there's still a little bit of like, what's this all about, type thing in the mainstream, but that doesn't make it bad. And that's just how it is, what it is. So, I enjoy it offline in the car.
I was curious about Annie's early days in music journalism and how she forged her career.
When I was in high school, I started writing about music. I was the editor of my high school paper, and we didn't have an entertainment section. And I said, we got to change that. And so as editor, I pulled rank and said, we're having an entertainment section. And so I started doing some writing in high school. I reviewed a Morrissey show. I reviewed a Duran Duran show, actually, with a friend for the newspaper. Those are the two that I remember. Did a couple other things too. Because I had really started reading music magazines and I had a different, I was interested in a lot of things as a kid. I was the type who taught myself HTML and made myself websites. I was really into computers and computer science. I really liked math. But I also really loved writing and music writing. And so, when I was in college, my first semester, I ended up working for the newspaper and doing a little of entertainment journalism. And I was like, no, I want to get an internship. And I specifically reached out to Alternative Press. Part of it was I could live at home and then I could just commute there, which was helpful because a lot of journalism internships, especially at that time, you might not get college credit for it. A lot of them just did not. And then you may or may not get paid. So I needed something where I could, still kind of get experience, but also, live at home or get a second job. And so like I did that internship and I also telemarketed. And so that was my summer where I had a job to make some money. And then, I ended up working for the magazine, getting experience, but it was very deliberate. Like I really wanted to work there and I really wanted to get into music journalism. So like, I still remember like putting together my little resume of like not very much stuff and like dressing up kind of nicely. And then when I was home for winter break, like going to the, having an interview at the, at the offices and things like that, which was very funny because it was a very casual office. So I was probably dressed better than like everybody that was there. But I obviously made a good impression and my clips were good enough. And so they hired me as a freshman, which was not necessarily the norm either, is that they were, they usually hired upperclassmen. But so I guess something stood out, and I'm grateful for that.
Annie's contribution to the 33 1/3 book series was on Duran Duran's classic album Rio. It seems to me that was a big turning point in her career, and I wanted to ask her about it.
100%. That's so funny because I had been wanting to write that 33 1/3 book for years. Like I had pitched Rio to the series starting in like the late 2000s. Like I pitched it in 2007 and 2009 and it didn't get included. And so then I kind of put it on the shelf for a while. And, I think it was 2018, they put out a call and I'm like, you know what? I'm going to be so mad if someone does this book and it's not me. And so I finally, got it together to get my proposal together and I put it in. But yeah, I would say, I think, and I worked really hard on that book. I wrote that book during kind of the early stages of COVID. So I was basically at home. Everyone, I could interview people because everyone was at home, but I was just, I put so much hard work into that because the album means a lot to me. Duran Duran means a lot to me. And I really wanted to tell the story in a good way. And so, yeah, I mean, and, when you release a book, you never know what's going to happen. You never know if people are going to see it. All you can do is really, do your best promoting it and try to, do what you can to make the book a success. And that book exceeded my expectations. It helped that I think the fans really found it and got involved, and the band was nice enough to to post about it as well on social media to really, kind of raise some awareness. But even just the word of mouth, like people, I think that's, having people be advocates and say, no, this is a really good book. Like you should try this, or, oh, I got this for a friend of mine, really helped. And that really did set me up and kind of raise my, I think, reputation a little bit for sure.
And what was it about Rio that made her want to write about it?
So I mean, so this is another album. I discovered this in high school, and so I was a funny kid because, and you probably remember alternative radio in the 90s. They were playing a lot of new music, but they were also really playing a lot of alternative 80s music. And so and I grew up in Cleveland, and our station was called 107.9 The End. And they would play, basically, new songs. And then in regular rotation, it's like, here's an 80s song from somebody, or, here's, the new song from Duran Duran, but here's, an 80s song as well. And so I was kind of coming to all those bands, all at the same time. Like Thomas Dolby's another one. They would play a lot of his new stuff and then also some of his 80s stuff. So I was a huge Duran Duran fan in the early 90s. Ordinary World, I loved Come Undone. And so I started going backwards, and I ended up getting Rio, I think, out of the library. I think because oddly enough, at that time, it was difficult to get the record, especially on CD. Like it had come out, but it was the pressings, like it wasn't very common. At least that was my memory of it. And maybe that was just me being a teenager and I didn't, have the ability to find where it was. But I remember it being difficult to find. And so I taped it off of the CD. And I remember being in band and just listening to this record. And there was just something about it that from, the first time I heard it, I was like, this is such a great record. There was just, maybe it was, the moodiness of it, obviously the music especially, but I just loved it. And, and obviously by that point, Duran Duran and Rio were very popular, everyone knew them. And at some point I figured out that the record was not popular right away. It took a little bit to become a success in America. It had to be remixed, and there was a lot of work that went into it. And I was always like, that is really fascinating, and I would always try to do research and figure out what that was. And you'd see things here and there, but it was this album also has a really good story behind it. There's a good story about, it became a success. It wasn't overnight. It took a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. So I knew it also had a good story, in addition to being an excellent record. So I think those kind of twin things made me be like, you know what, I want to write about this. And and as you know from being a music fan and following things, Duran Duran's popularity has ebbed and flowed. At various times, they've been very popular and very respected. At other times, people have been dismissed them a little bit more, or viewed them kind of with disdain. And I also just really felt like, this band really needs to get their due as musicians, as songwriters, as everything. It's really time. And so, it was kind of just a confluence of things. And I think I wrote a persuasive enough, basically pitch where, I kind of brought my fandom into it, but also my music criticism background and my reporting chops, just to say, hey, there's a really good story here. And my instincts were right. I think, and it's hard because when you're writing, in some sense, the story of Rio becoming a success is an industry story where, involved record labels and involved, various, reissues and stuff like that, and involved radio. And so, but it's also a story of resilience and perseverance. And that's a real timeless story too.
And what's next for Annie?
I have a bunch of stuff going. A couple things that, I kind of wrapped up that, we're sort of brewing, that haven't been officially announced yet. I do have a book, Beyonce, The Stories Behind the Songs, that is coming out in the fall. I can't remember the exact date. And that's kind of been a soft announce, but I'm also working on a book on Stevie Nicks, which is really exciting. It's going to be, for the same publisher as the Cher book. And it's going to be like really looking at her life and career through her music. I'm also a massive Stevie Nicks fan. Speaking of women, that it's been very gratifying to see them get their due. So, so that I think that comes out next year sometime. I have not sure the exact date, but yeah, so that's exciting. But I am so thrilled about the Cher book, especially, just because, I wrote her essay for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction when she was inducted this year. And, and kind of just researching and really kind of crystallizing everything about her, she is just, it's funny, for as much success as she's had, she's still sort of an underdog. She's still sort of underrated. And, whether, because of how she started off, or people have misconceptions about her, but, she's still here. I mean, when you look at her chart success and just, she's pushing along, she's talking about, doing another farewell tour. I think her last tour was a farewell tour. I think she's talking about doing another one. For all we know, by the time this airs, she'll have announced it. It's unbelievable. I mean, she is just, she works so hard, and in ways, when you've reached that point in your career, like, you don't have to. I think we all know musicians who are, like, I've had enough success, I'm good. And no matter what she's doing, she is making sure she's putting her best self out there. And I just love that. I think that is just, it's so, it's so inspiring, and it's such a great way to live your life, and your creative life and your personal life. And I just admire that so much. I have so much respect for her.
Thank you so much to Annie for taking the time to chat with me. She's not only a great writer, but a fantastic human being to boot. I'll put a link to her website in the show notes, where you can check out all of her books and the latest news. And a quick reminder that you can also buy my book on 80s musicians and where they are today, 80s Redux, and its sequel, Live Through That, on 90s Artist, wherever you buy your books. And if you like this show, please leave a review where you're listening. It always helps others find us. And of course, subscribe so that you won't miss an episode. Thanks for listening.